I heard it before I saw it. A sharp metallic scream tearing across gravel, steel dragged where it never should have been. The kind of sound that tells you something permanent just happened. When I rounded the bend toward my driveway, my truck slowed on its own. An 8-foot steel fence had been welded straight across the only road into my ranch. Fresh, galvanized panels. Dark weld marks still visible, heavy locks hanging from a brand new gate. A keypad blinking red, calm and confident, like it had always belonged there. On the other side stood the HOA president, Marilyn Prescott. Arms folded, shoes sinking into the dirt road my family had used for generations. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't angry. She spoke the way people do when they believe they're legally untouchable. She told me the fence was necessary under an emergency access provision. Something about temporary restriction authority when community safety is at risk. She even quoted a subsection number, as if that alone made it final. Until my cattle were removed, the gate would stay closed. No notice, no hearing, no court order, just steel between me and my home. I remember realizing how certain she sounded. Like this wasn't a threat, but a conclusion already reached. What she didn't know, what no one inside that subdivision knew, was that while they were busy fencing me out, I had quietly taken care of something they never thought to verify, the land beneath their only gate. And standing there in the dust, staring at that fence, I stopped arguing, stopped explaining, and did the most dangerous thing I could have done. I started paying attention. I lived just outside a small town called Red Willow Creek, Wyoming, on a 40-acre ranch. My grandfather settled long before anyone around here talked about associations, covenants, or development plans. To us, the land was never an asset on paper. It was work, routine, memory, fence posts set by hand, a barn rebuilt after hard winters, cattle moving the same paths year after year because animals remember things people forget. Most days were quiet in a way you can't manufacture. Wind moving through grass, hooves shifting at dusk, night skies so clear you could see the Milky Way without trying. That quiet lasted until Cedar Ridge Estates arrived. They didn't grow into the valley. They dropped onto it. Bulldozers first, then concrete, then rows of houses rising fast and clean, all measured and symmetrical. 200 custom homes wrapped around my ranch like a tightening ring. Decorative streetlights burned all night. Lawns stayed green even when everything else turned brown. At the entrance, a stone sign announced "Luxury Country Living," as if rural life were a brand you could buy without dealing with the reality behind it. At first, people waved. Some even stopped to chat. They said things like, "Must be peaceful out here," and "Love the open view." But it didn't take long to figure out what they really meant. They liked looking at a ranch. They didn't like living next to one. The complaints started quietly. Someone didn't like cattle noise early in the morning. Someone else complained about smells when the wind shifted. Another resident didn't like dust when my truck came down the road. Each complaint arrived as a neatly typed letter, polite in tone, stamped with HOA letterhead like that alone gave it authority. I shrugged most of it off. Ranching isn't quiet, clean, or convenient, and it never has been. Anyone buying land next to cattle should know that, or at least ask. Then the letters started arriving more often. Not complaints anymore. Notices. Community standards. Nuisance activity. Corrective action recommended. Every letter ended with Marilyn Prescott's name at the bottom, printed clean and centered. Marilyn didn't sound angry. She sounded professional. Every word was chosen carefully, like it had already been run past an attorney. When I finally met her in person, it made sense. Former corporate compliance officer. Calm, polished. She spoke in acronyms and section numbers, the way people do when they want to sound reasonable while setting boundaries you're not supposed to cross. At first, I thought this was just a misunderstanding. I tried talking to her directly. I invited her to walk the property with me, to see where the cattle actually stayed, how far they were from the houses, what a working ranch really looked like. She declined, citing liability concerns. Instead, she sent another letter. The fines came next, small at first. A few $100s for things that hadn't changed in decades. Grass height near a fence line that wasn't even part of their development. Equipment, visibility. Noise complaints logged at times when no one was even working. I paid one of them, thinking it would show good faith and make things settle down. It didn't. The fines increased. The deadline shortened. The language shifted from suggestions to directives. Marilyn started quoting bylaws in conversations that had nothing to do with her authority, referencing emergency provisions and safety exceptions like they were universal tools. That's when she made her first real move. She sent a notice explaining that the HOA had the authority to temporarily restrict access under an emergency vehicle access statute if a condition posed a potential safety risk to residents. She framed it carefully. Not permanent, just precautionary. Just until the issue was resolved. On paper, it sounded almost reasonable. That was the moment I realized she wasn't bluffing. She wasn't throwing tantrums or leaning on popularity. She was building a legal justification piece by piece and doing it well enough that most people wouldn't question it. I tried compromise anyway. I moved feeding areas farther from their fence line. I adjusted grazing patterns. I spent my own money adding fencing to create more distance, hoping that effort would matter. It didn't. Because this was never about cattle noise or dust or smell. It was about control. They wanted the image of rural life without the inconvenience of it, and Marilyn saw me as the variable that needed to be removed to keep that image intact. The turning point came when I realized she wasn't trying to fix anything. She was documenting. Every letter, every fine, every complaint was another page in a record, a paper trail meant to justify escalation. She wasn't reacting to problems. She was preparing for something bigger. I could feel it closing in. People who used to wave stopped waving. Conversations went quiet when I walked into local shops. The story being told about me was changing, and I wasn't the one telling it. That was when it became clear. Marilyn wasn't enforcing rules. She was setting the stage. The fence made everything feel final, but it was only the beginning. Within days, Cedar Ridge Estates escalated in ways that felt coordinated, not reactive. Black SUVs started showing up along my fence line early in the mornings. Private security. No badges, no names, just matching uniforms and body cameras that stayed on. They walked the perimeter slowly, deliberately, taking photos of my cattle, my barn, my water tanks, and my truck entering and leaving the property. One of them leaned over the fence and photographed a water trough like it was evidence. When I asked who authorized it, they didn't argue or threaten me. They just said, HOA directive, and went back to work. Online neighborhood groups lit up almost overnight. Posts appeared with carefully framed photos and alarming captions. A cow standing near a creek became possible water contamination. Dust kicked up by a feed truck turned into air quality concerns. Ordinary ranch work was suddenly described as a public safety issue. The language was always vague and urgent, never specific enough to shut down easily. Then Marilyn made her next move. She brought in an environmental consultant named Howard Prescott. The last name wasn't a coincidence. He was her brother. His credentials looked legitimate at a glance, and his report was written with confidence. It claimed my cattle posed a risk to groundwater, that runoff could threaten the subdivision, that conditions warranted immediate mitigation. What the report didn't include were soil tests, water samples, or any indication he'd actually visited my land. Still, Marilyn treated it like established fact. She forwarded it to the county, the HOA board, and every homeowner on the mailing list. Within a week, a local news station ran a short segment showing footage of my ranch shop from the road, paired with phrases like concerned residents and potential health risks. No one called me for comment. The fallout hit fast. At the feed store, conversations stopped when I walked in. A man I'd known for years suddenly avoided eye contact. Someone canceled a beef order without explanation. The land hadn't changed, but the way people looked at me had. The letters from the HOA grew sharper. Deadlines tightened. Fines multiplied. Then came notices warning about liens, written in language designed to scare you without clearly explaining what your options actually were. The fence stayed in place, pending resolution of safety concerns. Every time I asked who decided that, the answer was the same. The board voted. It didn't matter that I wasn't a member. It didn't matter that my ranch existed long before their bylaws. It didn't matter that no court had ruled against me. The vote was treated like absolute authority. I started to feel boxed in from every direction. Physically, by steel blocking my driveway. Financially, by fines and legal threats stacking up. Socially, by rumors filling the silence where conversations used to be. Even sleep became shallow, my mind replaying letters and phrases I couldn't escape. One afternoon, I watched a security guard photograph the same stretch of fence for the third time that day. He didn't even pretend to look busy, just click, step, click, step. That was when something finally clicked for me. They were loud. Every accusation was public. Every threat was written down. Every decision was emailed, forwarded, archived. Marilyn loved records. She loved documentation. What she didn't seem to love was restraint. They assumed volume was power, that if they repeated something often enough, formally enough, it would become true. They were so focused on overwhelming me that they never slowed down to check whether they actually had the footing they claimed. Standing there, watching another camera lens pointed at my land, I realized something important. They weren't being careful, and people who aren't careful always leave something behind, especially when they're convinced they're in control. After that, sleep stopped coming easily. I'd lie awake listening to the house settle, replaying every letter, every clipped sentence Marilyn had delivered like it was settled law. One night, well past midnight, I finally gave up and sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee that went cold before I noticed. If they were going to bury me in paperwork, I figured I should start reading the kind that actually mattered. I began where most people never look. County records. Old plats scanned so many times the ink looked tired. Survey maps drawn by hand, with margins filled by notes from people who expected their work to last longer than they did. Easements written in plain language, back when documents were meant to be understood instead of weaponized. At first, it felt like I was proving Marilyn right. Everything I pulled up pointed toward Cedar Ridge Estates. Access agreements. Development approvals. Pages of references that seemed to confirm the HOA's authority over the entrance road. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling that familiar weight settle in my chest. For a moment, I honestly thought this was the end of the line. That I'd spent hours chasing a solution that didn't exist. I closed the laptop and rubbed my eyes, more tired than angry now. I remember thinking that maybe this was how it happened, not with a dramatic loss, but with quiet pressure until walking away felt like the only option. Then I opened one more file. It was an older map, buried deeper in the archive, dated years before Cedar Ridge ever broke ground. The layout was different. The lines weren't as clean, and that's when I noticed it, a parcel number near the entrance road that didn't match the others. 2 acres, not listed under the HOA, not transferred during development, still privately owned. I cross-checked it 3 times before I trusted what I was seeing. The name attached to it was Earl Donnelly. Earl was one of the last old ranchers in the area. Quiet, stubborn, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. His land didn't look like much from the road, which was probably why no one had ever bothered to question it. But when I followed the easement language tied to that parcel, my pulse picked up. The entrance road crossed his land. The mechanical gate was anchored there. The emergency access route ran straight through it. Every vehicle that entered or exited Cedar Ridge depended on those 2 acres before touching HOA pavement. And the language was clear. Operational control had never been transferred. The HOA didn't own the gate. They never had. I sat there for a long moment, letting that sink in. All the confidence, all the threats, all the talk about emergency authority and safety provisions, built on an assumption no one had bothered to verify. The next morning, I drove out to Earl's place. He was sitting on his porch with a mug of coffee, watching the day come up. When I told him why I was there, he didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly. I wondered when someone would finally read the deed, he said. I told him everything. The fence, the fines, the pressure, the way the HOA was trying to push me out without ever saying it outright. He listened without interrupting. I made him an offer. Fair, clean, no games. He didn't argue or counter. We shook hands. A week later, the paperwork was filed, deeds recorded, titles transferred, everything done quietly, exactly the way it should be. On the surface, nothing changed. The fence stayed up. The patrols continued. Marilyn kept sending letters full of confidence and authority. But underneath it all, the ground had shifted. For the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was holding something they didn't even know existed. Once the land was officially mine, everything changed. Not in any way that showed on the surface, but in the way the situation finally made sense. I didn't send a letter. I didn't hint at anything. I didn't let anyone know what I'd found or what I now owned. I stayed quiet. And while I stayed quiet, Cedar Ridge did what people do when they believe pressure is working. They escalated. Emergency HOA meetings started popping up with almost no notice. Violation letters arrived in clusters, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time, each one more urgent than the last. Fines increased, deadlines shortened, and the language hardened. Words like recommendation disappeared, replaced by requirement and immediate compliance. It felt rushed, desperate. That urgency told me Marilyn was trying to force an outcome before something else surfaced. She didn't know what I had, but she knew time was suddenly working against her. Then I noticed the equipment. One morning, driving the far edge of my property, I saw survey flags planted near the back of the subdivision. Bright tape fluttering in the wind where it hadn't been the day before. An excavator sat idling near the tree line. Men in reflective vests studied the ground, pointing, pacing off straight lines that didn't match the land. I stopped and asked what they were doing. Drainage improvements, one of them said, too quickly. But drainage doesn't cut straight paths through protected land. Roads do. They weren't fixing water flow. They were planning an alternate access route. Straight through wetlands that had been documented years earlier. Land that required permits, environmental studies, and public notice before anyone could touch it. Marilyn wasn't trying to work with me anymore. She was trying to remove her dependency altogether. Quietly. I didn't confront her. I didn't warn the board. I took photos, pulled the permit maps, and made a few calm calls to the county. I asked one question and let the silence do the work. Is this authorized? It wasn't. Inspectors showed up before the end of the day. Work stopped where it stood. Red tags slapped onto equipment. Fines issued on the spot. The crew packed up without argument, leaving behind fresh tracks in the dirt and a very visible reminder that someone had crossed a line. That was when the tone shifted. Marilyn's emails grew shorter and sharper. Meetings moved behind closed doors. Security guards stopped making eye contact and started whispering instead. One of them quietly told me they were being asked to document things that didn't feel right anymore. A few days later, Claire Mendoza reached out. She lived inside Cedar Ridge, close enough to the fence to watch this unfold from the other side. She didn't accuse me or demand explanations. She just wanted to talk. She told me what homeowners were being told. That their taxes might increase. that property values were at risk, that the ranch was the problem, and if it wasn't shut down, the county could step in and rezone everything. That part was true, just not the way Marilyn was presenting it. Cedar Ridge's zoning depended on my ranch remaining agricultural. The development had been approved with that assumption baked in. If the ranch shut down, the zoning could change, and that change wouldn't hurt me. It would hurt them. Higher taxes, new infrastructure requirements, different compliance standards. The very thing Marilyn claimed to protect would take the hit. And the most important detail? I was still fully agricultural, fully compliant, fully legal. Every cow, every fence, every acre. Marilyn knew that. That's why she was rushing. That's why she was cutting corners and trying to build roads where she shouldn't. She'd told a simple story, remove the rancher, fix the problem, and now that story was collapsing under scrutiny. That's when the emails started leaking. Board messages forwarded quietly. Language that shifted from community safety to containment. Discussions about timelines, about forcing results before he figures out what he has. Too late. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought waiting meant surrender. They didn't realize I wasn't falling behind. I was letting them get ahead of themselves. And every shortcut they took, every rushed decision they made, every panicked email they sent was doing my work for me, building a record that would matter far more than any vote they'd ever taken. The emergency HOA meeting notice went out late on a Thursday afternoon, stamped urgent and scheduled for Friday evening, right when most people would be trying to get home from work. The timing wasn't subtle. Marilyn wanted a full room, heightened emotions, and just enough pressure to push something through before anyone had time to slow things down and ask questions. That was when I moved. I didn't call anyone. I didn't show up early. I didn't argue or make threats. I did something smaller and far more deliberate. Using the access controls tied to the parcel I now owned, I engaged the gate exactly the way it was designed to be used. No damage, no tampering, no theatrics. I entered the code, turned the key, and locked it. Temporarily, not out of spite, not to punish anyone, just long enough. Within minutes, cars began stacking up on the road. Headlights stretched farther and farther back as people realized their remotes weren't working. Some tried again and again, pressing buttons harder, like force might change the outcome. Others got out of their vehicles and walked up to the gate, staring at it in disbelief. Horns started to sound, one at first, then several at once. A delivery truck stopped awkwardly in the lane and tried to back up. Parents checked the time and glanced at restless kids in the back seats. A man in a suit paced while talking into his phone, his voice rising with every sentence. No emergency vehicles could get through. That detail mattered more than anything else. Inside the subdivision, everything looked normal. Outside it, the reality of dependence settled in fast. Phones lit up. Group chats exploded. Photos of the locked gate were shared with captions asking who was responsible and why no one had mentioned this before. The same question kept coming up in different words. Who actually controls this gate? Inside the clubhouse, Marilyn tried to start the meeting. She stood at the front with her clipboard, tapping the microphone, calling the room to order. But rows of chairs stayed empty. Nearly half the people she expected to see weren't there. Because they were stuck outside. She blamed a temporary technical issue. She insisted it would be resolved shortly. She tried to move forward anyway, skipping agenda items and rushing votes, but the room wouldn't settle. Every few seconds, someone's phone buzzed. Another update from the road. Another photo of the gate. Outside, frustration shifted into concern. Someone called the non-emergency line asking what to do if they couldn't access their own neighborhood. That call didn't disappear into a void. A county patrol vehicle arrived shortly after. No siren, no lights, just presence. The deputy stepped out, looked down the line of cars, the locked gate, and the growing tension. He didn't force anything. He didn't threaten anyone. He asked a simple question, almost casually. Who owns this access? No one answered. Inside the clubhouse, Marilyn's voice tightened. She leaned harder on phrases like emergency authority and safety provisions, but the words didn't land the way they used to. People were no longer listening to her explanations. They were listening to the situation. This wasn't an argument about bylaws anymore. It wasn't about votes or procedures. It was physical, immediate, inconvenient. A locked gate that didn't care about policy language. For the first time, residents could see what had always been hidden from them. Their elegant entrance, their sense of exclusivity, their assumption of total HOA control, all of it rested on land they didn't own. I stayed off to the side and watched. I didn't argue with anyone at the gate. I didn't explain myself. I let the situation speak in the simplest language possible. Steel, pavement, ownership. Inside the clubhouse, Marilyn kept trying to regain control by talking faster, louder, more urgently. But order doesn't come from volume. It comes from certainty. And certainty was gone. People began asking questions she couldn't answer. Why had this never been disclosed? Why hadn't the HOA mentioned access limitations? Why did an entire subdivision depend on something no one seemed to understand? The more she talked, the worse it got. And standing there, watching confusion replace confidence, I knew the timing was right. Not because people were angry, because they were unsure. And uncertainty is where assumptions finally start to collapse. I didn't step forward right away when the deputy arrived. I let the confusion finish doing its work. People were still arguing into phones, still demanding answers from Marilyn, still looking back and forth between the locked gate and the empty chairs inside the clubhouse. When the questions finally ran out of places to land, that's when I moved. I had a thin folder under my arm. Nothing dramatic. No speeches prepared. Just copies of recorded deeds, easements, and survey maps pulled straight from the county archive. The kind of paperwork that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. By then, a county traffic engineer had arrived, along with a code enforcement officer. Not because anyone wanted a spectacle, but because a blocked access road during peak traffic creates paperwork for someone, and no one likes unnecessary paperwork. I handed the folder to the engineer. He didn't react. He leaned against his truck, flipped through the pages, checked parcel numbers against his tablet, and frowned slightly, not at me, but at the inconvenience of having been called out at all. Marilyn hovered nearby, clipboard in hand, trying to explain. She talked about emergency access provisions, temporary authority, safety exceptions. She cited the same statute she'd quoted to me when the fence went up. The engineer didn't look up. When he was finished, he closed the folder and handed it back to her. "He's right," he said, flat and bored. "This is a private road." That was it. No announcement. No explanation to the crowd. No dramatic stripping of authority. Just a statement of fact. Then he turned to the deputy. "The road's blocked. Clear it." The deputy walked over to Marilyn's car, tapped on her window, and waited. When she rolled it down, he spoke calmly, like he was explaining a parking violation. "Ma'am, you're trespassing on a private driveway. You need to move your vehicle." She tried to argue, tried to explain, tried to pull the clipboard back into the conversation. The deputy didn't engage. He just repeated himself slower this time. "Move the car, or it'll be towed." That's when the clipboard slipped from her hands and hit the pavement. The sound echoed louder than any argument she'd made all night. No one laughed. No one cheered. People just watched, absorbing what they were seeing. This wasn't a dramatic takedown. It was worse. She was being treated like a minor problem, an obstruction someone else had to deal with, so traffic could move again. The engineer walked away without another word. The code enforcement officer made a note and followed. The deputy stayed until Marilyn moved her car. Inside the clubhouse, the meeting dissolved on its own. No formal adjournment. No votes. People just stood up and left, talking in low voices, piecing together what they'd just witnessed. No one asked me to explain. They didn't need to. The paperwork had done its job quietly, efficiently, and without emotion. Exactly the way real authority always does. The fence didn't come down right away. There was no announcement, no public admission that it had never been lawful in the first place. It came down the way power usually retreats when it realizes it's been overextended, quietly, carefully, and without drawing attention to itself. A few weeks later, contractors showed up early one morning. No HOA logos. No clipboard. Just welders cutting steel where it never should have been welded. Sparks hit the gravel. Panels were lifted, stacked, and loaded onto a flatbed. By midday, the road to my ranch was open again, the same way it had been for decades before anyone decided they could close it. The board didn't survive much longer. Marilyn resigned first. A brief email went out citing personal reasons and thanking the community for the opportunity to serve. It fooled no one. Within days, the rest of the board followed. Some stepped down quietly. Others were pushed out after residents started demanding explanations about fines, surveillance, and why none of them had known the HOA didn't actually control its own entrance. The new leadership that formed looked different right away. Meetings were shorter. Voices were lower. Words like enforcement and authority disappeared from the agenda. Everything was suddenly about clarification, cooperation, and making sure something like this never happened again. The paperwork followed. Every fine issued against me was reviewed, then voided. Liens were removed without argument. Letters arrived acknowledging procedural errors and overreach. They weren't emotional, and they didn't need to be. What mattered was that the pressure stopped. No more security vehicles idling near my fence. No more cameras pointed at my cattle. No more emails marked urgent. The noise that had filled my life for months drained away until the ranch sounded like a ranch again. Wind, animals, and long stretches of quiet. Inside Cedar Ridge, things were slower to settle. People were embarrassed. Some were angry. Others tried to pretend none of it had happened. But the illusion they'd been living under was gone. They'd seen how fragile their control really was, how dependent their gated community had been on land they didn't own and authority they never verified. About a week after the fence came down, I reopened the gate fully, not halfway, not conditionally, fully. I didn't add locks or post signs. I didn't ask for apologies or signatures. I restored access the way it had always been meant to function, because the point had never been to hold anyone hostage. A few residents nodded when they passed me on the road. Some waved, awkward at first, then more naturally. Claire stopped by one afternoon just to say thank you, not for the gate, but for forcing the truth into the open when no one else would. "You could have made it ugly," she said. I shook my head. Didn't need to. Keeping the gate locked would have turned me into exactly what they accused me of being. Opening it was the final lesson. I hadn't fought to control anyone. I'd fought to be left alone. People still asked me if it felt good to win, like this was some kind of contest I set out to dominate. I usually paused before answering because winning was never the point. I didn't want leverage or revenge, or to prove I was smarter than anyone else. I wanted my land, my peace, and the right to live the way my family always had, without someone else deciding it was suddenly a problem. What this whole experience taught me is how easily authority gets mistaken for volume. The HOA believed power came from rules quoted loudly, threats written formally, and paperwork used aggressively enough. They believed votes could replace ownership and repetition could turn assumptions into facts. But real power doesn't work that way. It sits quietly in records, in history, and in boundaries drawn long before anyone thought to challenge them. I could have kept that gate locked. I had every legal right to do it. I could have demanded apologies, forced concessions, or made life difficult just to prove a point. But that would have been the same abuse of authority, just pointed in a different direction. So I chose something else. I showed them the truth, made it impossible to ignore, and then stepped aside and let them pass. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. And in the end, that choice mattered more than any fence, fine, or threat ever could. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?